Okay, guys, today we're going to start moving into talking about the Civil War. All right, we've talked about slavery in the past and different reform movements and things like that, but as slavery keeps advancing, there's going to be a divide between the North and the South. The North opposes slavery, the South likes slavery, and eventually there's going to be a lot of things that deal with the issue of slavery, amongst other things, and it will lead to a civil war. So today we're going to talk about the things that caused the Civil War. Um, this is usually like a pretty in-depth PowerPoint, but I've cut it down to about half, and we're going to go through it pretty quickly so we can get all this in one PowerPoint presentation. So here we go. Um, so we've already talked about the Missouri Compromise, but this is going to be one of the first things that start the Civil War. Remember, Missouri wanted to be added as a slave state. But if we add Missouri as a slave state, then there's the unbalance of power. There'd be more slave states than free states. So then the states that have slaves will have more power. We don't want that. So in order to make Missouri a slave state, we're going to create a new state called Maine, and that will be a free state. So now the balance of power is the same. We also create that 3630 parallel. Okay, it's an imaginary line. Anything north of that line would be free in the future, and anything south of that line would be slave. So here's this map, the 3630 parallel. Anything north is free, and anything south is slave. All right, here's Maine up here, and then you have Missouri. The next compromise is going to come about 30 years later, and that's the Compromise of 1850. California wants to be added as a free state. Okay, and eventually to get that compromise, we are going to add them as a free state. And now in the future, we're going to start to use popular sovereignty. We talked about popular sovereignty a long time ago with the principles of government. Remember, that is where people will vote on the issues. So in New Mexico and Utah, in these two territories, whenever they start to become states, the people will be able to vote from now on in order to become a free or a slave state. Texas is going to give $10 million because we're going to kind of redo their border. Okay, this was not what it originally looked like. It used to like extend into New Mexico. So we give them $10 million. We're going to end the slave trade. However, slavery remains. So you can no longer buy or sell slaves, but you can still continue to have slaves. And the way slavery could continue is that any slave woman that has a child that child would still be a slave as well. And then lastly, I know it's kind of cut out with my picture, but Congress will pass a tougher fugitive slave law. A fugitive slave law was that if a slave escaped to the north, and you found out that they were a slave, you had to and you caught them or you saw them, you had to turn them in, or you had to kind of arrest them and take them down to their owner. So if you didn't and you were found of helping a slave, you could be in trouble. So we add California as a free state. Future states will decide by people voting. The slave trade ends, but we make a tougher fugitive slave law. That's the Compromise of 1850. Harriet Beecher Stowe is going to be a woman who writes a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin. We're not really going to talk about the book itself, but why is it significant? For the first time, people from the North are really going to start to see what slavery is like by reading this book, and they see how bad slavery is. And that's really going to start to push that abolitionist movement and push for the ending of slavery. So by writing this book, people read about slavery for the first time. It makes it more like appalling, and people end up having to end. People want to start ending slavery. As we kind of just said here, in the North, people started to be compassionate about slaves. They wanted to help slaves out, and they thought that it was ruining the nation. Whereas the South, they're going to be mad at this book. They feel that their way of life is threatened, and they become defensive and hostile. And this is going to continue to divide the North and the South. The next major cause of the Civil War is the Kansas-Nebraska Act. What's going to happen in these areas is they're going to use popular sovereignty to decide if slavery should be allowed or not. Okay, remember popular sovereignty is people voting on the issue. So what happens is people from the north and the south start to flood or move into Kansas and Nebraska. You want to have more people from the north or more people of the south so you can get that state to be what you want it to be. Um, and this is going to essentially get rid of the Missouri Compromise, because we're going to want to have this Kansas-Nebraska Act, and using, instead of having the north or south of that line, we will start to use people voting and popular sovereignty. So as I was saying, I got a little ahead of myself here. As Kansas starts to open up, and since we're going to allow people to vote on the issue, people start, called border ruffians from Missouri, start going into Kansas to help vote and try and win the election for it to be north or south, free or slave. As people from the north and south start flooding into Kansas, there's going to be a lot of tension, and eventually there's going to be a bunch of like fighting, and people are going to start killing each other. It's essentially a small civil war. It's not a full-blown civil war yet, but now you're going to start seeing people from the north and the south trying to get that state to be free or slave, and they're going to start fighting each other. Then we're going to get a new political party called the Republican Party. They're going to be essentially be anti-slavery Democrats, Whig Party, Free Soilers, and non-slave state farmers, professionals, small business owners. Essentially, Republican Party, think of the North and think about people who are against slavery. Their first presidential candidate is John C. Fremont. Once again, if you're a Republican, he opposed slavery, and he wanted to get rid of the Kansas-Nebraska Act because he didn't want people to vote. He just wanted to say no slavery, and he wanted to get rid of the fugitive slave law, which once again said if you found a slave runaway, you have to return them or you can be in trouble. The Republican Party won't see its first president until Abraham Lincoln in 1860. I'll talk about that in a little bit. Another major thing is the Dred Scott decision. Okay, so Dred Scott was a former slave. His slave owner, or he lived in Missouri with his slave owner. The owner took him into, I believe, Illinois and Wisconsin, and went for free states. His owner will eventually die, and Dred Scott said since his owner took him into those free states, he should be free. So he's suing for his freedom. Here's the ruling. The Supreme Court said that temporary residence in a free state does not make him free. So he is not a free citizen. He is still his property. He is still a slave. Slaves are not even citizens, so they cannot sue people. All right. At the time, African Americans were essentially thought of as property or as a work animal, so we're not allowing them to sue. And then to go one step further, Congress, our Supreme Court says that Congress cannot ban slavery, because you're taking property away without due process, meaning you don't have a cause to take away people's property. So essentially, the Dred Scott decision is a really big decision that helps the South tremendously. All right, it gets rid of the fact that slaves are people, they're citizens and proper. They're not citizens, they're property. They cannot sue, and then Congress cannot get rid of slavery if they'd like to. In effect, the Missouri Compromise is considered unconstitutional or not legal. The reactions are going to be similar to anything else we've talked about so far. The North is going to hate this, okay, and the South is going to love it. They're like, "Oh, you're protecting our rights, our property. We really like this." And the thing you need to keep in mind is the North and the South, they start dividing more and more as we go through this PowerPoint, and this is going to start building up until the Civil War. John Brown, we kind of talked about earlier a couple weeks ago about abolitionists. Okay, John Brown was a abolitionist, meaning he wanted to end slavery. He thought that God told him he should end slavery, but instead of using peaceful measures to try and end slavery, he uses violence. So he gets a bunch of slaves to rebel, and what they're going to do is they're going to seize an arsenal, which is a bunch of weapons, and arm themselves for a big rebellion. However, while he and the slaves start to do this, sorry, let me go back. While he and the slaves start to do it, they get caught he gets arrested and he gets hanged. The North thought that although they liked Brown and his ideas, they thought he went too far because he was using violence. But they still called him a martyr, which is someone who dies for their beliefs. The South obviously does not like John Brown, and they do not like what he did, and they think that he is just one person of many that are going to start to do this. So the South is going to start to get really upset, and they're going to really hate the North and abolitionists. Why is this significant? Once again, the division between the North and the South is going to continue to happen. They don't trust each other. They don't like each other. This is one big step in it, once again, leading to a civil war. In 1860, the Republican Party is going to win its first election as president, and that's going to be Abraham Lincoln. Okay, so if he's a Republican, remember he is against slavery. Essentially, at this point, this is the Democratic Party or the South's last straw. They're like, we're not going to stand for this. We don't want this guy that is going to get rid of our slaves to be our leader. So what they're going to do is they're going to secede from the United States and create their own country called the Confederate States of America. These states that seceded were considered South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. Think of this as essentially they leave the United States and create their own country in the South. Instead of having one United States, we have the United States up top of America, and then we have the Confederate States of America below, two different countries. They even elect their own president, who's Jefferson Davis. And this is the start of the Civil War. Because Lincoln gets elected, that's the last straw for the South, and the South leaves the United States, and now we're going to go to war because Lincoln is going to say, you cannot do this, we need to keep you as the United States. So we go to war. Even though he wants to avoid violence, it doesn't happen. So here's a map. Anything in gray would be the Confederate, anything in blue would be the Union, and then you have these border states, Missouri and Kentucky, Maryland. What's going to happen here is some of these people are going to say they're with the North, some are going to say they're with the South. So like where I grew up in St. Louis, there used to be a plantation right next door, so they owned slaves. But if you go further north into Missouri, they would be more of the Union, and they would not want slavery. Okay, so what you're going to be doing for the rest of the day is you're going to rank these in order. First of all, you're going to tell me what each thing is, and then you're going to rank them thinking which one's the most important to the least important. If you have any questions, do not hesitate to email me. Thank you. Bye.